Hello, everyone. My name is Luke Bideaux. I'm the president and CEO here at Vega Imaging Informatics. And with us today, we have Quentin Fisher. Quentin is the CEO and founder of Aidan Health since 2017. And Aidan Health focuses on the operational aspects of AI in healthcare. And Quentin has over 30 years of experience in the field. And we're excited to have him on the show today. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, look, happy to be here.
All right. And so, we're going to talk about the operational aspects of AI in healthcare and specifically in medical imaging today. Um, Aiden Health has developed a solution for that market, and we're going to kind of dig into some of the concepts behind that, and hopefully, our audience may find that interesting, and maybe some of these concepts they can relate to and take home within their organization. And so, let's go ahead and get into it here, Quentin. Tell us a little bit about your solution at Aiden Health and how you can help these organizations that are trying to make sense of AI, trying to figure out how they can optimize AI for their organization and make the most out of it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Luke. I guess, we've been doing this stuff since like 2017 before, and I've been doing it before that too, right? Before it was cool, right? And back then it was machine learning, and before that it was big data, all those things. And I think a lot of people just really struggle to understand what is AI and how to use it.
Right.
So we kind of came up with uh, an image, right? A metaphor. And we came up with this concept of a control tower, right? And as you're thinking about AI, how do you view that? Well, it's something new, right? It doesn't necessarily need to replace what you have, but it's something new. So because especially in healthcare, right? A lot of these systems are, big, integrated, slow, but people need to move quick. So there's this concept of like a two-speed IT. One, your transactional backbone that everything's going in, but then you want your system innovation. And that's where we came up with this concept of a control tower. It sits on top of your systems, right? And with that, it's got a data foundation, right? That's the fuel for this rocket ship, right? So where we kind of grew up in the roots of data and analytics, and that's really where everything starts, right? There's a lot less coding in these solutions because the models do a lot of it, but they rely on your data. And then when you're building these solutions, um, there's a lot more nuance because these are either machine learning models or generative models with large language model. They move around. I say they live in the wild. They're moving. They're kind of like a plant. That if you feed them and you take care of them and water them, they'll grow and get better and better. They'll improve. They'll compound, right? But if you don't, they'll wilt and die, right? So that whole kind of on top of that data foundation, we said there's this model kind of layer that requires, a testing harness and a care and feeding program to kind of keep them current. And then on top of that, you want these things to do things, not just look at reports, right? We spent a lot of time looking at reports, but we want to do. So that's where these processes are. And now you hear the term agents, right? So this is
Mhm.
agentic layer that sits on top of the models, on top of your data. And that is kind of the stack, right? And I think the interesting thing is too, all these business AI is like electricity, right? All these businesses are putting AI into everything that's going out there, but they're in their own silo or kind of that's all they know, right? And you as an organization, you actually want to use AI across your systems, right? So that you can optimize across your system. You might have 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 systems, right? And you want, you know, AI to be applicable across that. And that's where this, data foundation or lake is very important because now you have a consolidation point where you can then put your solution sets on top of. Um,
Mhm.
so that's
Yeah, I think
great.
it's interesting to hear this concept that organizations are not limited to just the vendor market out there, the vendors that are selling AI tools, and checking out the market to see what fancy new AI tool may be able to help them. That's all fine and good. They can evaluate all that, but it sounds like what you're saying is one of their valuable assets is their data, and they're not limited to just external solutions, but maybe in collaboration with a company like yours, they can build a custom solution that is fit for their data and their needs and use cases. And it's a different way of thinking about things, but I think many organizations are aware that they have valuable data, but they really don't know where to start with trying to leverage that data. Um, let's talk about that. Let's say you have an organization, obviously they have their data, and then they have their pain points, their workflow inefficiencies, and their goals on how they want to optimize their workflows. How do we get from point A to point B, taking the data they have and adding in these intelligence layers and things and agents maybe to help automate their workflows?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of the journey you're talking about. How do you start? Where do you start? And it's kind of all over the place. So just like we had the control tower as a metaphor to get going, we've actually enhanced that a bit. And we said it's not just a control tower, an airport control tower. It's actually bigger than that. It's really about you going from the ground to the air, right? And that's the kind of next level of kind of abstraction and solution capability. It is a transformative thing. So how do you kind of take advantage of that? Like we say, there's a lot of solutions that are building AI inside of them, and actually for some scenarios, that's entirely appropriate. You want to use that. It's cheaper. It's kind of comes along. You're paying a lot of money for this license. They're doing it, and if it's inside that box and that's all you need, that's great. So the analogy there is like when you're going from the flight to the air, right, or ground to the air. Um, you have different routes. Sometimes you just need a little little hop, right? Little Cessna, right? That could be an out of the box AI tool, right? Sometimes you need to take a bigger journey and that you need to start having some cross system things, but within a small team. Well, maybe that's one of these kind of turboprop things. Maybe you actually have to do a big route and you're really trying to do something transformational for your business. Well, that's kind of like, one of these 747s. So, and that requires, as you're kind of building these solutions, they require different governance and controls as well, right? As you're scaling up these solutions. So if you want to do kind of optimize scheduling from your radiology information system and tie that into, your outreach and calling and your margin analysis and this whole entire optimized process, that requires a fair amount of sophistication and integration across all these data sets and maybe multiple agents looking at different things to kind of build that out, right? Where a lot of times you might just want to have your own solution to do, you know, uh, j- uh, understanding your internal policies and giving a chat experience maybe to some of your customers. Well, you need to make sure you load up the right data that's there and you enable it for your customers. But once again, the exposure and the risk of that solution set will define the kind of the governance and controls you need to put around that, right? Internal is easier than kind of external, right? Operational is easier than clinical, right? So you have to have the appropriate governance for the use case that you're putting forth. Um,
Mm,
but data is so critical. But everybody's go, I can't do anything. My data's a mess. That's not the case. You need to build these solutions, use case by use case, and with the technology that's there now, it's actually a lot easier than it was, decades past.
yeah.
we used to have to build these databases, and you needed
Yeah,
a
no, I can speak to that too. Yeah, because I mean, structured reporting, for instance, in radiology has been around for a long time. And the concept was great that, if you, instead of filling out a big unstructured radiology report, let's start checking check boxes and filling in drop down fields so that it can all go cleanly in a database. But now, with the advent of LLMs being able to make sense of all those unstructured reports and basically, index them through the use of AI, um, things that really I never thought would be possible with, performing discovery or making sense of all those unstructured radiology reports now, it makes perfect sense and it seems, relatively straightforward. So, um, yeah, it's a great perspective about, you know, sort of addressing the concern that most organizations have that their data isn't good enough for AI or it's got problems that can't be solved. I'm always amazed things that I thought were not possible even a few months ago, then something, new advancements happen and, it seems very straightforward. So, um, yeah, it's a great perspective to share. I'd love to
and
get into some practical examples, what you were talking about there with, um, you know, taking data and then applying models and things to actually make an improvement. Do you have any practical examples, to share over the years, like a success story that others might find interesting?
sure, sure, sure. I think for one thing, just having a central spot for enterprise or organization wide information is super important, right? Because it's this data's here, that data's there, and it's very tough to become data driven and to really drive continuous improvement as you're um, when you're hunting for this data. It's all different. It doesn't tie, right? So I think just having one spot is super important. And I think we're moving towards more value-based care components, and outcomes are more and more important. And a lot of the requirements that are have for billing and getting paid for these services are going up. So you really got to have all your kind of ducks in a row, and kind of review that. So we're doing a lot of things where we're able to pull data in from multiple sources, but also before these claims go up, do kind of hygiene checks on them and understand them and catch the issues right before you start submitting those claims. It's also very good, yeah, quality of care check as well, right?
Yeah.
So
No, that's a great practical example, and I really wanna drive it home because, um, when we help healthcare organizations monetize their data, it's very frequent that we have to try to pull data from multiple sources and tie it all together. And sometimes it becomes overwhelming, the number of sources. I mean, you would think in today's day and age with EHRs, everything would be in the EHR, but that's not actually the case, especially in medical imaging. The images themselves don't live in the EHR, so you're always going to have some kind of PACS or archive with the images separate from the EHR. But then you have RIS and you have mammo tracking systems and you have places where the genetic reports live and on and on. And you know, I think what you said about taking control of your data, working with partners that can help you centralize it or at least develop solutions that can automatically pull from the multiple sources. I think it's just becoming more and more important.
yeah, yeah, it doesn't necessarily need to be there, but it needs to be, to your point, accessible from there. And
Mhm.
there's a whole kind of process where, do you just have it as a central access point, or do you want to stage it? And it depends a bit on what you're doing, right? Because if you want to do deep analysis, historical analysis, things like that, it might be better to kind of have it in a consolidated spot. But if you want to get real time updates, sometimes it's just easier to call it. But once again, have a central access point. And so there's that. There's kind of those batch oriented processes, and then there's kind of more things that are more integrated with real time, like scheduling and things like that. And there's a lot of other industries have solved this, and we're healthcare. There's opportunity there to help healthcare help more people, right? And doing schedule optimizations, things like that as well. Now that's a little more advanced because it requires some of that real time integration with your systems, right?
Right.
But there's a lot of lift there too, right? And a lot of benefit if you can kind of optimize that, even understanding no show rates and how do you kind of build a schedule that kind of resilient and internal processes to really kind of drive that kind of operational productivity and performance, right? So these are all tools that you now have available, and kind of back to that stack, right? You could have your own little models like analyzing certain things, and now it's actually a lot easier because there's so much a lot of time like with these agents, right? So they kind of sit on top of everything, but there's all this work that needs to get done that doesn't get done. And some of the highest ROI kind of solutions that we put in place are where there's kind of critical steps that they just can't hire enough people to do, right? And things just aren't getting done. Revenue side was one thing, but there's a lot of other operational aspects, right? And there's just a huge return on that because you can't hire or retain the people to get the stuff. It's kind of, a lot of the work is, drudgery. So how do you kind of enlighten the work life of some of your employees as well and have these, mundane but very important tasks taken care of? So I think that's another uh, kind of big lift. And as we're saying, like kind of from the Cessna to the turboprop to the 747, as you're scaling up in your automation and AI capabilities, your business processes and your data quality, all that stuff need to follow that same level of maturity, right? So that means that you might need more of these background processes running, so you can actually use AI to help clean your data, so that you can use more AI, right? To
Mhm.
drive more value, right? So it's a self reinforcing tool.
Now, I'm a little slower here, so bear with me. I want to try to really understand what you're talking about with trying to introduce this type of stuff. Because when I think about the real world, I think about, let's say you've got a hospital and they've got Epic and they've got whatever brand packs and they've got a wrist. These are not exactly systems that are ripe for integration. I mean, everybody knows the challenges of interoperability between systems. Although we do have standards, we have HL7, we have DICOM, and there's API front ends that you can integrate with. But trying to get anything going where you're now sort of you're within the risks or you're within the packs and you've got this new functionality that comes in from a third party integration, that is really asking a lot from the vendor and the organization. Many of these ideas don't get off the ground, but I think um, the interesting thing to think about is you're not limited to those systems that you have in place. Quentin, maybe you can help us kind of paint this picture of a data lake that's separate from your main clinical systems, um, and how this separate data lake can serve as the foundation for AI, and just how that would tie in with your actual clinical systems.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's a really good point. And um, yeah, so I think to your point, um, that, you know, it kind of goes back to that two-speed IT thing we were saying earlier, your kind of core transactional engine, and that's great. It's integrated, it's all this stuff, but you want to make you need something that moves a little faster, a little nimbler for some decision support tools, right? And so this is where this concept of a lake is really important, right? And trust me, these cloud vendors make it super easy to kind of try and load data up because they want your data in the cloud, right? So they really make it easy to kind of load data up. And it's if it's a if it's a if it if it's a batch type of transaction, it's a pretty easy motion to pull. Like think of it, nightly data pulls or every 2 or 4 hours. It's a very easy move. These trillion-dollar hyperscalers want your data, so they try and make it easy to pull it in there, right? So with that as a backdrop, right, that's a very easy move to pull it in, right? And you want to pull, and the concept of, and we're moving to this concept of a data lake away from something called a database, right? And the thing in a database is to get a bit technical here, you have to have a spot for every piece of data, right? So it's structure on write. So you need to have that data space enabled. Is that an integer? Is that a date? Is that a character? You need to do,
Right.
it's a lot of work, right?
Mhm.
With a lake, you don't need any of that. You throw it into the lake, right? And it's what we call structure on read. And that's very important because remember I was talking earlier about the agile nature of this thing being very use case driven.
Mhm.
With a database, you couldn't really do that because you had to build this whole thing and they will come, right? With
Mhm.
a lake, you just throw it in and you only focus on the 10% or 7% of data that you care about for that use case. So you throw it in the lake and then, oh, I got this great use case. Let's pull the 7% of data. Still got to structure it, but it's only on the 7%, not on the other 93% can stay there. And then you build your solution on top of that, right? And this is very powerful because I used to build these data warehouses and databases, and you had to predict the future before you built it. And what does that mean? Well, you needed to know how to slice and dice the data before you even saw the data, and you never got it right. So you
Mhm.
throw it into the lake, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, that's how that data looks. So, oh, let's look at it this way. No problem. Just add in another field. It's structure on read, right? So it's very flexible and agile, and it allows you to be much more data driven and to build these processes that go across your data. They call it a data mashup, right? So it's like all your data in there and you can go across your data. So it really truly follows your processes, your business processes, not your systems, right? And what happens, systems are defining our processes, but really, no, so now you can truly build these solutions on top of that. So, and that's really the power of it. And I think that's the thing where no one else is going to build that because nobody else has your unique EHR or RIS system or, accounting system or whatever, and that's what you got. Right. And if you can build things on top of that, and, and these are high value scenarios that go across these systems, right? That's, no one else is going to build that for you. So now there's a kind of a vehicle to do it. If it's within a system and there's a good roadmap for that Riz or whatever they're doing, right? Yeah, it's going to be cheaper to let them use it. Let them build it. That's that kind of, transactional backline, backbone, right? But if you want it sooner or you need to incorporate other data, that's where you have this vehicle now to have this system of innovation and really focus on what sets you apart for your customers and your market and kind of
Right.
build that.
Yeah, that's awesome. You know, in the field of medical imaging, one of the challenges we have in this specialty is the size of the images. Now, um, we've worked with many organizations that have been looking at maybe creating a data lake and maybe even a de-identified data lake. And, Vega certainly has the tools and expertise to help create a de-identified data lake of medical imaging data sets. But the storage costs in the cloud are a major, problem for these imaging practices. And then you have egress charges if you ever want to do anything with those images once they're up there. And so there's two major costs that are of concern when you're dealing with the actual images themselves. Now, I think it's important to state that maybe a good starting place would be the other valuable data that you have in your systems besides the images themselves. And that may include, patient and study information, radiology reports, other types of clinical reports that you may have. And it could even contain the metadata from the DICOM objects that you have if you have the right tools to scrape all that data and put it in the data lake. Um, and there could be all sorts of use cases and potential efficiency gains if you're able to harness the metadata about your images and develop AI that can maybe pull those images in on demand, or whatever the scenario is. Certainly here at Vega, we're all about helping AI developers get the data they need, and we do it on demand. And so if we had everything centralized in a data lake, even metadata de-identified already, be a huge time saver for us and much faster to delivery for our clients if we could perform discovery on that data lake, a centralized place, and just pull the studies we need in on demand. But yeah, I'm interested to hear your thoughts about the cost side of it in the cloud. You know, for larger organizations that have millions of studies, depending on the study types and volumes, you could be looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars per month in storage costs, um, depending on the storage tier as well, right? Because there's different tiers, but it can get expensive quickly um, for some of these larger imaging data sets that exist. So, um, how can organizations sort of battle that either through being careful with how they store it in the cloud, or just making sure that their ROIs exceed whatever costs they have.
Yeah. So I think, back to ROI, there needs to be enough juice for that squeeze, right? So, so I think that's one. We're very practical. We help a lot of mid-market organizations, and they don't have time for a lot of science projects. They need to try and get to value, right? Um,
Mhm.
and to your point, you don't want to be silly with these large image files. You don't want to have a bunch of duplicate records and things like that. But to your point, the metadata against that is super light.
Mhm.
And I would say outside of the imaging data, actually, the cloud storage is not an issue. It's compute that's the issue, right? And outside of the imaging, what we do, we actually store the data a lot of time. We have a lot of redundancy in our data, right? So a leading pattern in these lakes is something called the medallion architecture. Like we just had the Olympics, and bronze, silver, gold, right? So what people do, because storage is relatively, image aside, is relatively cheap, they land it into the bronze, and they do a bunch of cleaning functions, compute to clean the stuff into silver. And then that's like a nice clean data set. But then it's still not business ready. So then they'll do, some joins and aggregations and things like that can make it a little more usable for the business community. That's your gold layer, right? So you're actually storing it 3 times. But the reason you're doing that is because when you land it, you kind of run compute's expensive, right? So you clean it, you land it in silver, and then you kind of, okay, that's great. And then the data typically gets smaller as you go, because you're getting rid of all the noise, so it gets smaller, more refined. It's like, I talk about a lake, and you know, you get the oil right at the end because it's all refined, right? That's the idea. And then and then the last one is even much more curated and refined. And that is then typically what you're using for your analytics, right? Or you're then pushing that up to a machine learning model, or the agents are consuming that, right? And it's this refined set of data. And the reason it's cheaper is because you kind of ran through that kind of pipeline, that cleaning and curating pipeline once, right? But then you can use that many times. And you're then hitting that curated data set many times. And you're not having to go through that whole process of cleaning it, and curating it. So that's why storage in that case is cheap, because it's the compute that's expensive and you want to kind of get that state. So on the imaging, so what you want to be doing is really extracting it, kind of pulling the right metadata so that you can do a lot of that analysis. And that may be the data that you end up using for a lot of your machine learning and things like that, right? And the intensive analysis on the image itself, right? What actually is really valuable in a lot of cases is the output of that analysis, and then what you're doing with that output from the analysis and putting that into processes, right? So I think those are some ideas, but outside of the imaging side, we've actually been pretty liberal with storage, but then we can tier it, to your point, and this is where you have cold storage, when you're archiving strategies, you have your hot, your cool, and you're kind of you put this stuff and you can't get at it for a week, but it's really cheap, right? So you're like, okay, I can wait a week to get it, but it's super cheap. So you want to have different strategies um, as you're doing that. Yeah, and I think the other thing too, what I found kind of really hits you right from a cost is when you start moving whatever cloud you're in across regions, right? And you get this these transfer costs going across regions. That becomes expensive. So you want to make sure that you're inside of you're operating within a region, and you don't have those transfer costs, because that data is literally moving across the country then, right? And that's so you want to kind of have your home base and make sure that that's your anchor, and then you have a backup strategy that's appropriate, but you don't want to be moving stuff all over the country. And that gets really expensive too, right? So those are some kind of lessons.
Yeah, I mean, as you're talking, it just reminds me of a lot of the AI developers we work with. We work with a lot of commercial AI developers. We supply them data that we source in collaboration with our facility sources, and they have a lot of these frameworks and strategies to develop their AI. And I think it's interesting that um, the lines between the commercial AI vendor and the healthcare provider can start to kind of get blurry and maybe come together with the advancements in AI development, the ease of development, things that, you know, healthcare organizations maybe never would have dreamed of doing years ago. Now, maybe, it's time to think about a division of the business focused on AI development instead of always thinking about, it's us and it's them. It's our healthcare providers and then it's the third party AI developers out there. Um, yeah, it's going to be interesting to see, over the next few years, how many healthcare organizations take the leap into some, at least stepping in the right direction, getting started with a data lake, thinking about governance strategies and things like that. Um, I know there's a lot of interest in it. The ACR has launched their Arch AI program to help organizations um, understand the frameworks and be able to attest to their adoption of best practices in that area. And I think it's only going to grow. Um, what's starting as guidelines and best practices can eventually morph into more formal um, either practice parameters or legal frameworks that you must work within, if you want to participate in certain reimbursement programs and things. We'll have to see how the future pans out, but
Right.
there's certainly a lot of potential here for healthcare organizations to do a lot more with AI development than they previously maybe thought was possible.
Yeah, and I think to your point, the machine learning and the other AI techniques and solutions, they're getting easier and easier to use. And I always and there's a lot of open source out there, right? The academia is all about open source, right? And it's kind of interesting, right? I mean, like to do these models and to use like there's actually nothing proprietary about them. These are they're all in research papers, right? So it's open source, right? And when you think about what differentiates you and what sets you apart, it's not the algorithm, right? You know, that's open source, right? And or it could be super cheap, right? Maybe you're using maybe one of these, and it's super cheap because it's a little bit better, and then you got an open source model. That's not the differentiator. The key is your data, right? It's your data that's your moat, right? Everybody talks about defending and your competitive landscape. Your data is your moat, so you need to treat it as intellectual property and a critical asset, right? The other thing that is differentiated for you is your processes, and that's those agents on the top, right? So you got your data, kind of going back to that control tower, right? You got your data as the foundation, right? That's the thing that you guys have, and that only you have, right? And then you have these models. It's just but the thing there is that you need to have the right capability to do the testing, the validation. There's some new skills you need to learn how to do that, but the algorithms themselves aren't there. You need to have some capability to do that. But then the other thing is like how you're applying it. How what these how you're taking action with these models and how you're baking them into your processes. And a lot of talk has been like it's not a technology barrier anymore, right? The technology is kind of there. A lot of times it's a change management and a process kind of redefinition in order to kind of get these things in place to start driving more value. Um, and I guess that's kind of why we kind of came back to that concept of you're moving from the ground to the air. You're fundamentally operating with a bunch of different controls that you never had to know and do before, right? You use these agents to do some things. You ask it a question 100 times, you're not going to get the same answer, right? There's a distribution. So how do you model that and understand that? You build these kind of machine learning models. They're still probabilistic uh, too. So how do you kind of manage that? What are the controls that you have in your organization? And things drift over time too, right? So as data changes and all these things, right? So so it's not this kind of static, deterministic view that we had with maybe software code or other things, right? It's an evolving thing. So you need to have the skills and capabilities into your organization to take advantage of that. So that's kind of I think back to ground to the air. How do you jump up there? What are all the new tooling you need? What's the education that you need? What's your flight instructor, right? To kind of get you to the ground, but then also keep your certification because you need to maintain these things. There's a lot of interesting analogies that we're truly operating in a different plane, right? At higher altitude. But not everything needs to be up there, right? You still need a good ground game, right? But there's certain routes and certain key processes that are very important to be, taking advantage of these new capabilities.
Yeah, I hear you when you talk about it's a change management problem. Healthcare historically has always been slow to adopt new technology. I look at the cloud, the movement to the cloud. Boy, I tell you, I never really thought it would ever happen with when it first was, becoming a trend because most healthcare organizations were so worried about getting outside of their own security constraints and putting their data in the cloud. It was just so unfathomable that they would go beyond this set of security guidelines that they had in place. And almost every other industry went to the cloud, and now we're seeing healthcare in general moving to the cloud. And it's almost now become unfathomable to think that um, any one healthcare organization could beat Amazon or Google in the security stance that they have, right? So, um, yeah, I see the same thing with AI happening. We've been battling it for years, and I know you're in the same boat. Um, Many organizations are still hands off with AI because they don't understand it and they don't want to take the risks, and so therefore they just stand by and they'll wait, for the rest of the industry to do it, and then they'll catch up. Um, and so I think it presents a unique opportunity for those that are willing to invest the time and effort into it now to really differentiate your practice, your healthcare organization over others, and gain a significant advantage if you can achieve some of the operational goals that you're trying to achieve with it. So I think we're both singing the same song with go out there and take a fresh look at your strategies when it comes to AI. Now is better time than any um, to go out and reach out to experts in this area. We both of us have our expertise in this area, and there's plenty of other experts out there. You're not alone with this, and it's easier than ever as well with AI to learn something new. Um, and do research on your own and figure out um, your strategies. So, just want to encourage everyone, to think about your stance when it comes to AI and your data governance and strategies for actually leveraging AI to do something useful and help you um, help your bottom line, help you gain the efficiencies that you need. So I think with that, we can wrap up here. Quentin, are there any final thoughts you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think you have to be responsible in doing this, and governance and ethics, all those things are very, very, very important, right? But uh, at the same time, jump in and start doing with these kind of, if you're new to it, there's a lot of safer use cases to kind of jump in and attack, to go after, right? And so yeah, learn by doing. And to your point, Luke, make sure you got some friends around you to kind of guide you through that, right? And but it's important that people kind of jump in, because that's the only way to kind of move forward, is by doing. Yeah.
Okay, well, I just want to thank everybody for their time, and we'll see you next time here on Vega Insights.